or why did we invent? And that's probably a good way to describe the Global Africa Project. Lowry and I started this literally almost 40 years ago. Lowry Simmons and I were Girl Scouts together. We were in high school together. We were in the same Girl Scout troop. She's the other sister, my other twin. And she and I not only were Girl Scouts together, we went to undergraduate school together, and then we went to grad school together. And when we got to grad school, we were very frustrated because there were no courses that talked about the kinds of history that we were very interested in. You have to remember that within our timeline, Lowry and I were right in the middle, came up through the civil rights movement. You know, I went to the March on Washington with Martin Luther King. We came up through the Black Arts Movement, and we were right there in the middle of the feminist art movement. We were there with gay and liberation issues. We were there with the anti-Vietnam protests. So our history was ripe with discontent. Lowry and I decided in grad school that we would do independent studies. And we studied with Warren Robbins for about 2 years. We would go over. We would have mini seminars talking about different issues. And at every juncture that Lowry and I turned within our professional careers, we were always told that artists of color, women, self-taught artists, gay artists, everybody who wasn't a white male was not part of the discourse. Everywhere we went. And Lowry and I were looking at this history contemporaneously as we were experiencing and realizing this is nuts. All right? At the same time, the guerrilla girls are running all over the country asking the same questions. Lowry and I are asking similar kinds of questions. And we begin in our professional career to start writing essays and catalogs and curating shows that talk about the different ways of seeing art. Lowry had moved from being the president and director of the Studio Museum in Harlem after having spent 27 years at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 20th Century division to the Museum of Arts and Design. And the Museum of Arts and Design was formerly the American Museum of Arts and Crafts. And they had changed their name and they had changed their mission. And they wanted to do something on Africa. And Lowry said, oh, I have this project that Leslie and I have been working on. And they loved it, at least when we first described it. And then when we started to get into it, everybody was going, but what is it? But what is it? And we were trying to figure out how to name it, you know, because lots of shows have sexy names. And we said, I don't know that it can be named. And as we began to develop the show, we started to ask some really hard questions that really went back through our entire careers. Working with all of the artists and me teaching hundreds and thousands of graduate students and undergraduate students, and her working with professional artists and museums, and the two of us always having worked together on joint projects. Well, it came to the point where we decided that it was time to talk to the artists that we were looking at, who we were beginning to confirm how our checklist was going to look. Who were the artists and who were the objects? And it was when we began to talk to the artists that we really understood that there was no name for this project, but the Global Africa Project. The artists told us, no, don't change it. You can't change it. Because each one of the artists brought an individual vision. If we tried to name it, it would corrupt or sabotage the visions that each one of these artists was bringing to this project. We had over 100 artists. We have over 250 art objects. I mean, there was no way to condense it into a singular thing. The other thing was that we realized that Africa was a psychic place. Because one night Lowry called me up and she said, what about the white people? I said, what do you mean, what about the white people? What about the white people in Africa? I said, well, Lowry, I was never discounting the white people in Africa. I mean, what about the Europeans who went to Africa who were born there? What about the explorers? What about the missionaries? What about the generations of colonialism that happened there? They are as much a part of Africa and New Africa as the so-called Africans and as all of the other Africans who migrated willingly and unwillingly, voluntarily and involuntarily, that migrated across the world. So the diaspora of Africa really became a question of what is African? And as we began to fold in all of these different artists, we then had to ask ourselves questions conceptually about materials. What are the materials they're using? What are the concepts they're drawing from? How are they dealing with tradition and ancestry? How are they dealing with legacies? How are they dealing with contemporaneous issues, landfills, disease? What kind of cooperatives are they coming forward with? And that's how the Global Africa Project came to be. We did not depend on theories. We did not go to scholars who had the last definitive word on what it was, because that's not what it was. What we found was that Africa has become the new fountain of creativity, of innovation, of directives that give us solutions for what our problems are going to be for the 21st century. And whereas Africa was always looked upon as the exploited continent, Africa has now become the continent of innovation.